everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to revisit a color combination that I pulled towards the end of last year, didn't use in a video, and promised that I would come back to again. But before I talk more about the project, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Cindy. Cindy, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. At the end of 2025, I had a project where I wanted to play with complementary or split complementary colors. And I pulled two different palettes. One that was this beautiful persimmon, teal, and iris, and then another that was the same persimmon orange color, but with, I think, I don't remember, it was like mint and turquoise, but two colors that were brighter. I ended up going with the brighter colors for that project because the point of that video was for me to go outside of my color comfort zone, and that felt less expected for me. But I promised I would come back to the teal, iris, and persimmon colorway because that is something that really drew my eye, and I want to speckle with these colors and create some beautiful magic on yarn. Speaking of yarn, we're going to play with two different yarn bases today. We have KnitPicks Bare Paragon and Bare Swish DK. Now Swish DK is a base that we know and love, we play with all the time. This yarn is 100% superwash merino wool. Paragon is a very luxurious yarn, and you can just see the drape even from how I have it held, just like how much it drapes and falls. Paragon is a non-superwash yarn. This yarn is 50% merino wool, 25% alpaca, 25% silk. It is super soft, and I expect our colors will be a little bit more blown out, probably a little bit less sharp than they will be on the Swish, but we're gonna have fun playing with the colors and having our side-by-side comparison. I'm now gonna go pre-soak all of our yarn in some plain tap water with no acid for a couple of hours. Since we're going for our speckled colorway today that will have some whites in it left behind, it doesn't matter if our yarn is completely saturated because if there's dry spots, there's going to be undyed areas in there anyway. But for scheduling purposes, waiting at least an hour is what works best today. Now, the second thing is, since we're going to be adding speckles, I could go ahead and add acid to our pre-soak before we start. But sometimes after I start pre-soaking the yarn, I change my mind over the technique I like to do. So therefore, I always like to pre-soak the yarn without adding vinegar or citric acid to it, because then when I go and start dyeing the yarn, if I change my mind about the dye application and technique I want to do, that gives me the most flexibility. Once again, the colors I plan to use today are Dharma acid dyes in Teal Green, Intense Iris, and Persimmon. Now, the iris and the teal are both more saturated jewel toned colors, and our persimmon is a lot brighter. And I think it'll pop with the contrast that we have in all these colors and will result in a beautiful speckled palette. I let all the yarn pre-soak for about 24 hours, which was longer than I had intended, but isn't a problem. Now, I do need to add acid because we're going to be using acid dyes, and acid is an important component of everything. So let's see, let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, there have been times that I've wondered if adding acid directly onto the yarn like this could, I don't know, cause like the colors to strike unevenly, more in some patches than others. But we're doing an uneven application to our yarn today, so it isn't something I'm gonna worry about. Now, and also I'm not gonna worry about making a mess. Now, if I were gonna go ahead and try to get more even coverage on this yarn, well, I probably wouldn't apply acid to the yarn before applying dye. But you can remove the yarn from this this pre-soak bath entirely before applying any dye to it. So that is always an option. But I really like to try to bring you through my thought process with everything. We're gonna speckle on 4 skeins today. The 5th skein will be our yarn mop. When I have any dye on my gloves, I will wipe it on here. But the other important thing to remember is that I do want my fingers to be nice and dry each time we go into the dye containers. Now, as I remove our Paragon yarn from the pre-soak, I do want to be gentle because this is non-superwash. And I want to remove a lot of the water, but we need to have some water left in here so the dyes can stick to something. And I'm going to go ahead now and spread out the yarn on my countertop. You could leave it unspread like this, but by spreading it out, especially initially when I'm not worried about smearing any color, this allows us to get color through all of the different insides of the yarn, and also allows the application to be a little bit more random. Because with the yarn scrunched, if I put the dye in a line, it's not going to be like in the exact same spot in the skein. And now we're ready to go and start speckling. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves so we could start speckling. Normally, I would try to do the first bit of the speckling in real time, but I am starting to lose my voice and it's a lot harder to speak with the respirator mask on, so please forgive me for doing a voiceover for the entirety of the speckling portion of this video. With one color at a time, I took a pinch of the dye powder in my gloved fingertips and then, without separating my fingers completely, rubbed my fingers together to allow those powders to fall onto the surface of the yarn. There's enough liquid in the yarn so that way the dyes can dissolve and apply their color where they've landed. When you're doing countertop speckles like this, less is more, because you'll see eventually, once we go and steam set the yarn, the colors are going to spread out and bloom more than what they appear when I first add the powder onto the yarn. If I was doing some kind of immersion dye bath, you would see the intensity of the color more right away because the dyes would dissolve as soon as they come into contact with the yarn and hot water. But when things are dry, it can sometimes take a little longer, and especially with certain colors, like I believe the intense iris is one that tends to surprise me further down the road. But don't worry, I advise adding less dye than you think you might want, because after you go ahead and steam set your yarn, you can always do another round of speckling if you want to increase the intensity of any of your colors. Now, in between changing colors, I did have some dye powder left on my gloves, and so I went and I wiped it on another skein of the Swish DK yarn that I like to call my yarn mop, because I'm literally mopping up the extra dye off of my fingers onto that yarn as a bonus colorway. And in fact, I will also use that yarn to wipe down the counter once I've finished speckling this first round of yarn. Sometimes I like to wait a little bit before I flip the yarn to add dye to the other side. I'm not sure how important this variable is when it comes to dyeing yarn. I think that sometimes letting the dye powders sit on the yarn for a little while can allow the dyes start to dissolve and sink into the yarn a bit, so that way when I lift the yarn, they don't fall onto the surface. The main thing that I try at this stage when I'm flipping the yarn and rearranging it is to try to not to rub the yarn on the surface, because I don't want to smear the colors that much. Unless, of course, that is your goal and you want to smear and smudge the colors a little bit. You can get gorgeous effects with that, like we'll see with the yarn mop once I'm done. But I continued to apply dye onto the second side of our yarn, and with just 200 grams of yarn on the countertop, applying dye to the yarn on both sides usually is sufficient to get good coverage. If I had my countertop more crowded, then I might want to do a third or even fourth flip. Once I was satisfied with the color coverage, I took the yarn, put it in my steamer basket over boiling water to steam set the yarn for at least 30 minutes. And then I brought over the yarn mop, as I mentioned, to wipe up any of the powder that was left on the counter. And you can see the way the three colors are coming together in such a beautiful way. I adore this color combination, and I'm really excited to see how it's going to turn out. Now I'm not quite done because I want to repeat the process on our superwash merino wool yarn. Now, Swish and Paragon are very different yarn bases for many reasons, but the Swish is a superwash merino wool. It is going to both absorb the colors faster, so we'll get sharper speckles, even though with this technique we're going to see some spread of the colors, but we should have sharper, more intense patches of color. But also, since this particular yarn base does not have any silk content, the colors in the yarn may end up feeling more saturated and intense in the end. And this is really for two reasons. One, the dyes may not spread as far because colors will strike faster to superwash yarn than non-superwash, but also in general, silk needs more dye to appear as saturated in the end as a wool. The one asterisk here is that since we're speckling, the colors are going to be very saturated where they are placed, so they may still feel very intense on that Paragon yarn that we dyed first. But it's hard to know for sure until we see how everything comes together in the end. Once I was satisfied with the color coverage, I let the yarn sit for a moment. I've timed this so that way I can add this yarn to the steamer basket as I'm about to remove our Paragon yarn from the steamer basket. Or at least that was my goal. Okay, it has been 30 minutes. I'm gonna remove the lid. And you can see, ooh, we got some beautiful speckles in here. You can see how the colors have bloomed. I'm gonna bring my other container closer so I don't drip on the floor, but you can see that the colors have spread a lot. And I wouldn't even necessarily attribute that to the yarn being non-superwash, but in contrast, here is where we currently are with our Swish yarn. And I'm going to steam set her for 30 minutes. But a combination of the heat from the steam and the moisture from the steam is going to allow those colors to spread out. And then once I'm done steam setting our Swish yarn, we'll go ahead and steam set our yarn mop, which is also looking very beautiful. And now, check out that transformation. You can see all of the colors so much more than we could have before. I'm also going to go set this one aside to cool. And that yarn mop I mentioned is going to have to wait for its turn to get steam set just because I have an appointment. Normally, I would pop it in for 30 minutes right now, but instead, it can just sit at room temperature and I'll pop it in when I return, let it steam for 30 minutes, and that one I will remove off camera. So I'll see you shortly when it's time to start washing everything. Let's start washing all of our yarn, well, except for the yarn mop. That I'll wash in a little bit. Now you'll notice that I have a glove on one hand. That is purely because I have a cut on one hand, and so I am trying to protect and keep that band-aid dry. Otherwise, at this stage, I wouldn't usually bother wearing gloves. Now, I'm not anticipating any color bleeding, but you never know what might happen when you add soap, especially when you are adding dry powder onto damp yarn. This is definitely a situation where some of the powders, especially if I add it too heavy in spots, could remain on the surface and then need to get dissolved and rinsed out. But it does not look like we're going to have much of a problem here today. Let's see. Yeah, and in fact, even with soap, I am seeing no color bleeding. But look at the speckles. This color combination is phenomenal. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and finish rinsing out the soap. Then I am also going to take our yarn mop and wash it. I'll put all the yarn through the spin dryer and hang it up to dry. But the one last thing that's worth noting is right now the colors on the Paragon feel very similar to that on the Swish. And so we'll see if that continues once things are dry or if the Paragon's going to feel less saturated. I can't wait to find out. It is a little challenging to completely compare our Paragon, which don't forget is our wool alpaca silk blend, to our just superwash merino wool. This is non-superwash. This is, I would say at first glance, the colors feel a lot more punchy and vibrant on our superwash yarn. There's more contrast between our speckle colors and the background than there is on the Paragon. And in particular, I think if we compare, say, our teal green, our intense iris, the persimmon is a little bit similar. Some of these comparisons can be user error, or if not user error, like I could have been heavier when I speckled onto this yarn than I did here. But I do see discrete speckles on the Paragon. It's not that things are blown out completely, because in the Paragon over here you do see little itty bitty specks and then some spread, and that same effect is present on our Swish as well. Without more analysis or variables that I have here, I'm inclined to say that the difference between the two is based on the fact that we're superwash and we're not a blend. Non-superwash has alpaca and silk. And so from experience, speckles are sharper on superwash yarn than non-superwash yarn. And I find that colors need a little bit more time on alpaca blends and on silk blends. And silk blends, when they're mixed with a superwash wool, can have very sharp speckles, but they do end up feeling less saturated in the end. And so I feel like we have a very similar colorway here, but we definitely still have some differences. Color palette wise, if we zoom back, I feel like the teal green is the most minor of the colors we have in here today. And maybe it's because it was hard to pull that out of the container because it was down near the ends of the teal green, so I just wasn't adding as much. I did have a whole second container of teal green I could have opened, but I was trying to use up what I had of the first one. And I don't know, I just think that it's funny that, like, looking back and looking at the yarn on the thumbnail, I'm feeling that iris and persimmon a lot more than the teal, even though it's definitely present. And I think that the color combination is really fun. I'm so glad I circled back to this. I don't want to say that speckles are an obvious choice when you're playing with multiple colors together, but it certainly is an easy way to use multiple colors together. But I have to say, the yarn mop today is so fun. This time the persimmon is the minor player and our iris and teal are what show through a lot more. And I think that that just has to do with the fact that those pigments stuck to the gloves more. There was more pigment on my gloves when I went to wipe my hands over onto the yarn mop. And that's why those two colors are more dominant here. I don't know if this is coming up on camera, but especially if I sort of move two of them aside, I feel like the difference in saturation between our Swish and our Paragon is a little more apparent now, but I'm also not sure if the camera's picking that up. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter because both colorways are gorgeous. Cindy, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really hope that you've enjoyed the video and that you're gonna love your yarn. It is so fun to do the same technique on a lot of different fibers. And I hope that everyone has enjoyed watching it, but especially Cindy. Thank you again. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. This is the biggest way that you can help support the content here. But if you'd like to learn more about how to become a lab partner like Cindy, go and check out the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop, where you can also find a lot of hand-dyed yarn that's ready to ship that has been featured in my videos. I'll have links to everything down in the video description. Now, do you have any color combinations you'd really like to see me play with, speckling or otherwise? I love to play with color and yarn, and I do try to keep track of your comments and suggestions, and will frequently pull from that as I go and work on new videos. And again, I'm so happy I came back to this colorway. I knew when I had pulled both of the colorways that this was something that wasn't something that I think I've done before, but felt very me, and I was very excited to play with it. And so, I don't know, I'm just so happy looking at all this yarn. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and not only am I inspired by your questions and suggestions, but frequently when I am rambling on in these videos, I make suggestions to myself that then I go and write down. And so then I have this massive list of things and questions that I muse over. And one thing I know I want Editing Rebecca to write down is that I want to play around with this color combination even more in the future. Not just with Speckles, but I feel like there's some other fun ways we could play with this. Ooh, I'm feeling very inspired by this palette. But anyway, thank you so much for watching.